On the morning of the appraisal, the house looked like a promise. Fresh flowers on the dining table, lemon oil on the wood floors, a soft, clean glow on every surface where someone's hand had passed with a cloth and a prayer. Outside, the grass sat trimmed and edged, the hedges squared just enough to signal care without pretending perfection. Denise stood in the doorway of the small third bedroom, looking at the framed photos lined across the wall. Wedding pictures, family reunions, a sepia-toned shot of her grandmother on a porch that no longer existed, in a neighborhood the city had quietly erased with a highway. Every frame held a black face. For a moment, she let herself feel proud. This house had started as numbers on a mortgage document and a set of keys in a plain envelope. Now it was theirs, in the loud, beating heart way that meant more than deed records. Dishes in the sink after long weeks. Crayon streaks low on the hallway wall from her niece. Scuffs by the front door where Malcolm's boots had brushed the paint. This was the place where they planned to build more than a life. They planned to build equity, leverage, something to hand forward. The refinance was supposed to be the next step in that plan. Lower interest, cash for repairs, a chance to strip away some of the debt that had followed them out of school like a shadow. For weeks, they had run numbers the way some couples planned vacations. Amounts on lines meant widened driveways, updated wiring, maybe even the start of a college fund if they were ambitious. Everything hinged on one thing: the bank's appraiser. The name on the email meant nothing to them. The process was supposed to be objective, mathematical, square footage, comparables, the age of the roof. The part of Denise that still believed in procedure clung to that. Malcolm trusted numbers even more than she did. He had built a career on spreadsheets and forecasts. Sitting at the kitchen table late at night, he showed her charts about the neighborhood, how homes within a few blocks had climbed in value as the city expanded outwards. They both knew the history everyone now pretended to forget. For generations, Black families had watched their neighborhoods treated as less valuable, less safe, less everything. But this area, realtors had promised, was different now. Integrated, up and coming, equal. Denise had wanted to believe that the appraiser's clipboard would see what they saw: a rising market, a solid house, years of work. The appraiser arrived 5 minutes early, climbing out of a compact car with the logo of the bank's appraisal contractor on the side. White man, late 40s, short haircut, neutral expression smoothed into professional blankness. He carried a tablet and a tape measure, his polo shirt tucked too tightly into his khakis. He introduced himself in the same tone he probably used 10 times a week. Denise caught the quick flicker of his eyes from Malcolm's face to hers, to the interior of the house behind them. His gaze paused for a fraction of a second on the family photos in the hallway. The moment was nothing, she told herself. Just a glance. He moved through the house in short, efficient bursts, tapping notes on the tablet, pulling the tape measure across rooms, opening closet doors. Denise trailed him for a while, then stopped, realizing he did not actually want her explanations about the new insulation or the upgraded water heater. He nodded at details without really seeing them. In the living room, his eyes slid over the black art on the walls. The carved wooden figure Malcolm's aunt had brought from Ghana, the framed poster from a civil rights march. His face did not change, but something in his posture stiffened, just enough that Denise's stomach clenched. Outside, he circled the yard, peered at the roofline, marked down something about the nearby train tracks. The fact that the train made the commute possible did not appear anywhere on his screen. He left quickly, with the same neutral politeness. No hints, no comments, only a vague assurance that the report would go back to the bank in a few days. Those days dragged. Denise returned to her usual routines, grading papers, answering student emails, the quiet rituals of a teacher's life. Malcolm went back to his office, where budget forecasts behaved like puzzles that could be solved if he stared long enough. Both of them checked their phones too often, waiting for the bank's notification. When it came, the number on the screen felt like an insult masquerading as data. The valuation sat tens of thousands of dollars below recent sales on their very block. Houses smaller than theirs, with older roofs and less updated kitchens, had sold for far more. The report described neighborhood risk factors and external obsolescence, phrases that sounded like a diagnosis of a disease that only existed when people like them lived on a street. The low number had immediate consequences. The bank's offer for the refinance dropped. The interest rate advantage shrank to barely worth the paperwork. The cash-out amount, the key to their plans, almost vanished. The debt that was supposed to lighten remained heavy across the spreadsheet. Denise felt the hit in her chest first, then in her face, as if someone had slapped her with a stack of pages. Years of being told to be grateful for what she had tried to smother the anger rising in her throat. Malcolm felt it in his teeth, grinding at night. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling fan shadows, recalculating in his mind, trying to find some variable that made the appraiser right and his own research wrong. Numbers were supposed to be neutral. If they pointed one way, that was the truth. Yet every time he pulled up the public records of nearby sales, the pattern mocked him. Their house, on paper, was worth substantially less, even though it shared the same sidewalks, the same sunlight, the same flight path of birds across the yards. He started listing things in his head that might explain it: the train tracks, the slight slope of the lot, the older fence. Each excuse felt thin and flimsy against the reality of the improvements they had made and the market around them. Denise felt something else beneath the disappointment, a familiar, bitter taste she had learned to recognize. It tasted like the teacher who once told her parents their daughter was bright, but best suited to practical paths. It tasted like the landlord who had been surprised at how neat they kept their old apartment, as if he had expected ruin. It tasted like every subtle note that said, without saying, "You and people who look like you bring the value down." She did what she always did when something hurt too much to hold alone. She carried it into conversation. At work, in the faculty lounge, she talked around the edges of the appraisal with a colleague she trusted, making sure her tone stayed light enough that no one could accuse her of being too sensitive. She shared the number, the comparables, the appraiser's brief visit. The colleague, a white woman who had moved into another neighborhood on the other side of the city, frowned in that way people did when they stumbled over a truth they had never had to face. Later that week, in a coffee shop away from the campus noise, the colleague asked more questions. She had looked up articles, cases, think pieces. There was a term for this, she said: appraisal discrimination. Others had reported similar gaps. One number when the appraiser saw a black family's life on the walls, another when the house was stripped of any sign of their existence. The stories made Denise's skin crawl and her jaw set. She recognized the details: family photos taken down, Afrocentric art removed, white friends asked to stand in as pretend owners. The idea lodged in Denise's mind like a splinter she could not stop touching. She brought it home to Malcolm that evening, laying down printed pages on the same table where they had once dreamed their refinance into being. He read silently, his eyes moving faster as the pattern repeated. Lowball appraisals, accusations that black homeowners were overreacting, second appraisals with white stand-ins that suddenly discovered hidden value in the same walls. For a moment, he resisted. His training, his pride, his entire understanding of fairness in systems pushed back. He did not want to believe that the problem was that they had dared to belong to themselves in a house. Then he remembered the appraiser's eyes on their photos. The way the man's body had subtly changed shape in the living room full of their world. The language about neighborhood risk in a block slowly filling with new, whiter neighbors. He felt something in him snap, not loud, but permanent. The colleague, her name was Hannah, heard the full story and did something Denise had not expected. She offered herself. If they wanted, she said, she would pose as the owner. She would stand in the doorway, answer questions, walk the appraiser through rooms that no longer carried traces of Denise and Malcolm's lives. She spoke hesitantly, aware of how strange the suggestion sounded, but also with a kind of quiet fury at the idea that her face could change a number by itself. There were risks, of course. Another appraisal cost money they did not really have to throw away. The bank might refuse. The contractor might send the same appraiser again out of spite or habit. And if the theory was wrong, they would not only waste time, they would wound themselves further. Denise's first instinct was to reject the plan. The thought of erasing her life from her own home just for the chance to be treated fairly made her stomach churn. Yet the more she thought about it, the more she realized that the erasure had already happened, just in a different form. Their value as homeowners had been reduced without ever touching their walls. In the end, they decided not to argue with reality. Reality needed to be exposed. They scheduled a new appraisal with a different lender in a process that required careful wording and an almost theatrical level of planning. This time, they did not mention their race in any casual call or email. They kept their names, yes, but arranged for Hannah to act as the person opening the door, the one the appraiser would interact with in person. The preparation felt like a cruel dress rehearsal. They spent a weekend stripping the house of themselves. Every photo that showed their faces came down, frames wrapped in towels and stacked in a closet. The art left the walls, replaced with neutral prints of landscapes and abstract shapes Hannah lent them. The kind of decor found in staged houses and glossy magazines. Cookbooks with black authors on the spine went into bins. Hair products disappeared into drawers. Denise's collection of black literature shifted into boxes in the trunk of their car. Cultural traces, small, daily, precious, retreated into temporary exile. The house became a version of itself, built to be palatable. On the morning of the second appraisal, Denise and Malcolm left before the scheduled time, carrying laptops and unease to a coffee shop across town. Hannah parked in their driveway, let herself in with the key, and took her place amid the carefully curated neutrality. The appraiser arrived on time. Different contractor, different car, different white man in business casual. Hannah greeted him with the easy politeness she used in every setting where her presence had never been questioned. He moved through the house, much as the first appraiser had, measuring, tapping, entering information. Only this time, there were no black faces on the walls to glance at, and no carved figure from Ghana to stiffen his shoulders. There was only a woman who looked like him, standing in what appeared to be her tidy, tastefully decorated home. He asked about upgrades. She repeated the details Denise had drilled into her. He peered at the yard and the roofline. The neighborhood statistics on his tablet had not changed since the first appraisal. The train still ran. The street still contained the same mix of families. He left within half an hour, promising that the report would follow. At the coffee shop, Denise checked her email with the twitchy compulsion of someone waiting for lab results that could alter the course of a life. Malcolm watched numbers scroll across his mind, preparing for disappointment, bracing for a second insult. When the new valuation arrived, it did not arrive as a whisper of change. It arrived as a shout. The number was dramatically higher, tens of thousands of dollars more than the first appraisal, now in line with and even slightly above recent sales on their block. The house, stripped of them and temporarily given to Hannah in performance, had suddenly become exactly as valuable as Malcolm's research had suggested all along. Denise stared at the screen until the figures blurred. Her brain tried to find explanations that did not involve skin. Malcolm did the same, clicking between the two reports, comparing notes. He counted differences in chosen comparable properties. The second appraiser had picked homes closer in style and condition. The language in the narrative section framed the neighborhood as transitional and desirable, rather than risky. Yet none of those choices explained such a drastic gap without the thread they both saw running between them. The thread was Hannah's face, and the absence of their lives from the walls. What they held now was more than hurt. It was evidence. Hannah's face, when they showed her the numbers, registered something like nausea first, then anger. She knew, in theory, how race altered outcomes. She had taught courses on inequality. Yet seeing her own presence become a lever that wrung more money from the same house unsettled her in ways that articles never had. She urged them not to let it slide, so they did not. They gathered everything, both appraisal reports, photos of the house before and after it had been neutralized, a timeline of visits, screenshots of neighborhood sales. They wrote out a detailed account of the experiment, careful and factual, stripping away emotion in the document the way they had stripped family photos from the walls. Then they sent it to the bank that had commissioned the first appraisal, to the lender who had hired the second, and to regulators who oversaw fair lending practices. They copied a local fair housing organization that specialized in discrimination complaints. At first, responses were slow and cautious. The original bank suggested that appraisals were subjective, that differences could arise from legitimate professional judgment. The contractor that had sent the first appraiser issued a bland statement about investigations and quality control. What they had not expected was that someone at the housing organization would leak their story, without names at first, to a journalist who had been collecting similar accounts. The story, once it hit a major news site, took on a life of its own. Readers saw the numbers and recognized the pattern from their own lives, their own parents' experiences, or the stories they had heard in quiet conversations. Other Black homeowners wrote in about appraisals that felt like insults. Some admitted they had never considered doing what Denise and Malcolm had done because the thought of erasing themselves from their own homes cut too deep. The journalist eventually persuaded Denise and Malcolm, along with Hannah, to tell their story with names and faces. They agreed, not because they craved the attention, but because anonymity began to feel like a softer version of the erasure they were fighting. A camera team walked up the same driveway where appraisers had once stood. The crew filmed the photos being rehung, the art returning to the walls. They documented the stack of reports, the lines of code that had turned human lives into risk categories. The public reaction combined outrage with recognition. Under that pressure, regulators moved faster. An investigation opened into the appraisal company and the bank's oversight practices. Civil rights groups used the story as a case study in long workshops about generational wealth and its theft. The bank, wary of the reputational damage, reached out. In a series of tightly managed calls and meetings, representatives offered explanations that relied on statistics and processes. Denise listened with a calm she had built out of exhaustion. Malcolm listened with a spreadsheet in front of him, numbers ready to undercut each polite excuse. Eventually, the bank chose the only path that might stop the hemorrhaging of its image. It acknowledged error. Not in every line item, not in the clean, cathartic way people imagine, but in the ways that mattered. It rescinded the first appraisal, flagged the appraiser for review and retraining, and offered a significantly better refinance package than they had originally sought, with terms that made practical sense and financial amends. More importantly, under the eye of regulators, it announced changes to its appraisal oversight, secondary reviews of outlier valuations in majority Black neighborhoods, randomized audits, bias training for appraisers that went beyond check-the-box modules, partnerships with fair housing groups for ongoing monitoring. Those changes did not fix the past. The homes that had been lowballed and sold, the opportunities that had been missed, the tuition never paid with equity that did not exist. None of that could be unwound by a press release. But for Denise and Malcolm, something else shifted. The house they had once prepared like a product for sale now held another layer of meaning. The walls had seen their faces removed and restored. The floorboards had felt the footsteps of appraisers and camera crews, lawyers and advocates. The dining table had held both bills and printouts of new laws being proposed in their state to address appraisal bias. They refinanced on their own terms, finally, turning some of the equity into overdue repairs and a modest savings cushion. They also set aside a portion for something that had not been on their original spreadsheets. They joined, and eventually helped lead, local efforts to educate other homeowners about the appraisal process. In community centers and church basements, Denise explained what they had done. Malcolm translated the financial jargon into plain language, breaking down how a lowball valuation could echo down through generations. Hannah came to some of those meetings too, sitting in the back at first, then eventually speaking about what it had felt like to be the face that unlocked value. Her presence became a visual reminder that racism in systems did not need cartoon villains. It often needed only unexamined assumptions and silent cooperation. In those rooms, people cried quietly over similar stories. Some left with a plan to request new appraisals, to file complaints, to demand explanations instead of accepting the first number handed to them as inevitable. The house at the center of it all kept standing, brick over foundation, roof over rooms. It did not change color or shape. The city's sun still hit its windows at the same angle every afternoon. What had changed was the unseen ledger where someone else had once written this black couple's home down as worth less simply because it held their lives. Now, in files at banks and on servers at regulatory agencies, a different entry existed, a case where a white stand-in exposed the scam. The paperwork, dry and bureaucratic, contained within it the echo of something more human, a refusal to accept invisibility, a willingness to turn a painful experiment into proof. For Denise and Malcolm, the victory did not feel like fireworks. It felt like walking through their front door every night, knowing that the value of the home had finally been dragged closer to the truth, pulled there by their own insistence that they and their neighborhood counted. It felt like rehanging a grandmother's photograph in the hallway and seeing, in the curve of her mouth, the same stubbornness that had carried them through. The next time they cleaned for visitors, they did not consider taking anything down.